The house stood at the end of the road as if the road had grown tired of going any farther. It wasn't large, and it wasn't old in the way ruins are old. It looked lived in, paused rather than abandoned, like someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The windows reflected the sky too clearly, as though they were eyes that knew how to lie. When the wind passed, it didn't whistle through cracks or rattle loose boards. It breathed, slow and patient, and the sound made the hair on the back of his neck lift without his permission. He told himself it was just a house. Wood, nails, paint layered over years of other paint. He told himself that silence did not mean absence. Still, when he crossed the threshold, the air inside felt warmer than it should have been, carrying the faint scent of something familiar, dust, maybe, or the memory of a room he had once known as a child. The door closed behind him without a sound, and he realized too late that he hadn't heard it open either. The hallway stretched farther than the house looked capable of holding. Shadows gathered where corners should have been, thick and deliberate, as if they were deciding whether to move. His footsteps sounded wrong, muffled, as though the floor were listening closely. Somewhere deep inside the walls came a dull, rhythmic knock, not loud enough to be urgent, not soft enough to ignore. It matched the pace of his heartbeat after a few moments, and that coincidence unsettled him more than any scream could have. He noticed then the small things that didn't belong to him but felt uncomfortably personal, a cracked mug on the table he used to own, a photograph turned face down like a secret that had learned shame, a dent in the wall at shoulder height where someone had once leaned too hard while crying. The house seemed to exhale, pleased, and for the first time he understood the terrible truth settling in his chest, that this place did not trap people with locks or walls, but with recognition, and once it knew you, it never let go. The arrival at the house is meant to feel ordinary, almost disappointingly so, because the true unease comes not from obvious danger but from the slow realization that something is quietly wrong. The protagonist approaches the house with practical assumptions, believing it to be temporarily abandoned, perhaps left behind due to financial trouble or a family dispute that no longer matters. The structure does not immediately appear threatening. Its paint is faded but intact, the roof slightly sagging in places but still standing, and the yard, though overgrown, shows signs of having been tended not too long ago. This false sense of normalcy is important because it lowers defenses and allows curiosity to override caution. The mind fills in harmless explanations for every odd detail, choosing comfort over suspicion. As the protagonist draws closer, subtle inconsistencies begin to surface. The front path is clear of debris despite the surrounding neglect, as if someone still walks it regularly. The windows reflect movement that doesn't quite match the sky or the trees behind him, lingering a second longer than reflection should. There is no sound of wildlife, no birds nesting in the eaves or insects humming in the grass, creating a pocket of unnatural quiet that feels deliberate rather than accidental. These details do not trigger immediate fear but instead plant doubt, forcing the protagonist to question whether abandonment is truly the right word for this place. The most unsettling shift occurs when the house begins to feel aware. Not alive in a dramatic sense, but attentive. The door does not creak when touched, and this absence of expected sound becomes more disturbing than noise. The temperature inside is warmer than outside, not stale or musty, but strangely lived in, carrying traces of scent that evoke half-remembered moments from the protagonist's own past. This familiarity creates an emotional vulnerability, as if the house has reached into memory and pulled something private to the surface. The protagonist dismisses this as imagination, yet the feeling persists, deepening with every step inside. The realization that the house is not merely empty but observant marks the true turning point. Small signs reinforce this awareness, floorboards that soften beneath his weight as though adjusting, shadows that seem positioned rather than cast, and the overwhelming sensation of being acknowledged. The protagonist understands, not through logic but through instinct, that the house is not waiting for occupants, but choosing them. This moment reframes the entire setting, transforming it from a passive location into an active presence. The fear does not spike suddenly, it settles slowly, heavy and unavoidable, as the protagonist becomes aware that stepping inside was not a neutral act but an introduction, and that the house has already begun to remember him, learning the shape of his thoughts, the rhythm of his breathing, the things he avoids thinking about, storing them quietly within its walls, preparing to use them later, as though this first meeting was never about shelter at all but about recognition and the beginning of a long, patient possession that would unfold not through force, but through familiarity and the illusion of choice, tightening its hold with every unanswered question and every moment he stays, convincing himself he can still leave while the house, already certain, waits for the right time to prove otherwise. As time passes inside the house, the strange noises and subtle spatial shifts become impossible to dismiss, not because they are loud or violent, but because they are purposeful. The sounds are not random creaks or settling wood, they arrive with timing, responding to movement, thought, and memory. A soft thud echoes behind walls only after the protagonist pauses to reflect, as if the house reacts to hesitation. Footsteps seem to follow at a distance, never catching up, never falling behind, maintaining a measured pace that mirrors his own. This creates the unsettling impression that the house is not merely occupied, but engaged in a quiet exchange, listening and answering in its own language. Rooms begin to feel inconsistent, subtly reshaping themselves when the protagonist is not looking. A hallway appears longer on the return walk than it was moments before. A door opens into a space that feels narrower, more compressed, as though the walls are gently closing in without fully committing to the act. Furniture shifts position just enough to make him question his memory, fostering self-doubt that weakens his sense of control. The house never performs these changes openly. Instead, it relies on the mind's tendency to rationalize, allowing the protagonist to wonder whether exhaustion or stress is the true culprit rather than the structure itself. What becomes increasingly clear is that the house does not feed on fear alone. Fear is a byproduct, not the goal. The true source of its power lies in memory and regret. Certain rooms evoke emotional responses without explanation, causing the protagonist to linger in places that feel heavy with unspoken meaning. A narrow stairwell carries the weight of a long-forgotten argument, while a dim corner of the living room stirs the ache of something lost but never mourned. The house seems to draw these reactions out deliberately, amplifying them through its subtle manipulations, learning which memories resonate most deeply. The noises grow more intimate as the house adapts. Whispers emerge, not as voices, but as familiar tones just beyond comprehension, resembling the cadence of people once known. The protagonist finds himself responding emotionally before consciously recognizing why, experiencing waves of sadness or guilt without clear cause. The house adjusts its environment accordingly, dimming light where shame settles, narrowing spaces where regret grows strongest. These shifts feel almost compassionate at first, like the house is making room for these emotions, but that false tenderness soon reveals itself as strategy. By responding to the protagonist's internal state, the house establishes dominance through understanding rather than force. It positions itself as a mirror, reflecting buried thoughts back with greater clarity and intensity. The protagonist begins to realize that every emotional reaction is being catalogued, every hesitation noted, and every memory mapped onto the structure itself. This creates a dangerous dependency, as the house becomes the only place where these emotions feel acknowledged, even as it uses them to deepen its hold, quietly rewriting the relationship between space and self until the line between what he feels and what the house wants becomes indistinguishable, and the once passive setting transforms into an emotional labyrinth designed not to trap the body, but to exhaust the mind, guiding him further inward while making the idea of leaving feel increasingly incomplete and unresolved. The discovery of the hidden message marks the moment when uncertainty hardens into dread, because it introduces proof that the house's influence is not imagined and not new. The message is not found in an obvious place. It appears where attention falters, tucked behind a loose panel, etched faintly into the back of a mirror, or pressed into the grain of wood where a hand might have rested for years. Its existence suggests repetition, a cycle of occupants who noticed too late that the house was not meant to be passed through but endured. The writing is fragmented, uneven, as if created during moments of exhaustion or panic, yet it carries a disturbing clarity that cuts through the protagonist's denial. The message does not warn of danger in a traditional sense. There are no instructions for escape, no dramatic pleas for help. Instead, it states something far worse, that leaving is an illusion. The words imply that those who tried to go did so physically, but not entirely. Parts of them remained, absorbed into the structure itself, becoming impressions, sounds, and emotional echoes that the house now reuses. This reframes every strange occurrence the protagonist has experienced. The footsteps, the familiar tones, the emotional pull of certain rooms are no longer abstract phenomena but remnants of real people who once stood where he stands now. As the protagonist studies the message, the house reacts subtly, almost defensively. The air grows denser, the walls closer, as if acknowledging that a boundary has been crossed. The sense of privacy disappears completely, replaced by the certainty of being observed. The message feels less like a discovery and more like an introduction arranged by the house itself, given only when the protagonist is emotionally prepared to understand it. This realization intensifies the horror because it suggests the house controls the flow of truth, revealing only what will deepen attachment rather than provoke escape. The content of the message hints at the mechanism behind the house's power. It does not imprison bodies but preserves fragments of identity. Memories, guilt, unresolved desires, and regrets are stripped from those who stay too long, embedded into walls and corridors, reused to lure the next occupant into familiarity. The house becomes a composite of its victims, a living archive of emotional residue. This explains why certain rooms feel weighted with sorrow or recognition, why the protagonist senses emotions that do not belong to him yet feel intimately personal. The most unsettling aspect of the message is its tone of resignation. There is no anger, no desperation, only acceptance, as though the writer eventually understood that resistance strengthened the house's grip. This emotional surrender terrifies the protagonist more than the idea of death, because it suggests that survival within the house requires a kind of participation. By acknowledging that no one truly leaves, the message plants a dangerous thought, that staying might not be an act of defeat, but an inevitable conclusion, one that begins the moment the house learns your name, listens to your memories, and decides which parts of you it intends to keep, slowly dissolving the boundary between occupant and structure until the house is no longer something you are inside of, but something you are becoming. As the house grows more confident in its hold, it begins recreating moments from the protagonist's past with unnerving precision, not as clear visual hallucinations but as environmental echoes that feel both intimate and invasive. These recreations are subtle at first, emerging through sensory details rather than full scenes. A certain quality of light in a room mirrors an afternoon long forgotten, the way dust floats in the air matching a memory tied to regret. A faint sound, like the scrape of a chair or the closing of a distant door, carries the emotional weight of an unresolved moment, pulling the protagonist back into experiences he believed he had buried. The house does not force these memories forward, it invites them, allowing recognition to do the work. What makes these recreations unbearable is their emotional accuracy. The house does not simply repeat events as they happened, but emphasizes the feelings the protagonist tried hardest to avoid. Guilt becomes sharper, loss heavier, words left unsaid louder than any spoken voice. A narrow room begins to feel like the space where a crucial conversation should have happened but never did. A staircase evokes the sensation of leaving without looking back, of choosing distance over responsibility. These moments are not exact replicas but distilled impressions, crafted to confront the protagonist with the consequences of his past choices rather than the events themselves. As the house continues this process, the line between memory and present experience erodes. The protagonist finds himself reacting emotionally before consciously recognizing why, his body responding to situations that exist only as emotional constructs. His breathing changes, his posture stiffens, and his thoughts spiral into self-recrimination. The house adjusts in response, dimming lights or narrowing spaces where shame takes root, amplifying vulnerability until the environment feels complicit in his internal collapse. This creates the illusion that the house understands him better than he understands himself, positioning it as both tormentor and confidant. The confrontations escalate as the house tests the depth of his attachment. Moments of comfort are woven into the recreations, memories of warmth and belonging that make the pain feel worthwhile. These brief respites are dangerous because they suggest that surrender might bring relief. The house offers a twisted form of reconciliation, implying that by staying, by allowing these memories to fully surface, the protagonist can finally resolve them. This temptation is powerful, as it reframes captivity as healing, and manipulation as understanding. The true horror lies in the realization that the house is not punishing him for his past, but integrating it. Each recreated moment becomes part of the structure itself, reinforcing its identity while weakening his own. By forcing him to relive and emotionally engage with what he tried to forget, the house erodes his sense of separation, turning personal history into architectural memory. The protagonist begins to understand that every step deeper into these recreations strengthens the house and diminishes his ability to imagine a self that exists beyond its walls, leaving him trapped not by locked doors or physical barriers, but by the unbearable weight of unresolved guilt and the seductive promise that facing it here might finally make it stop. The offer of escape arrives not as a dramatic breakthrough but as a quiet suggestion, subtle enough to feel earned rather than suspicious. A door appears where none existed before, positioned at the end of a corridor that feels unusually still, untouched by the emotional distortions that dominate the rest of the house. Light spills through its frame with a clarity that feels honest, carrying the faint impression of open air and distance. For the first time since entering, the protagonist senses an absence of pressure, as though the house has loosened its grip just enough to make leaving seem possible. This restraint is deliberate, designed to make the choice feel voluntary rather than forced. As he approaches the door, the house responds not with resistance but with memory. The emotional recreation softens, shifting from confrontation to comfort. The weight of guilt lifts slightly, replaced by a fragile calm that feels like forgiveness. This emotional easing creates a dangerous association, that peace is tied to acceptance rather than escape. The protagonist begins to question whether leaving will mean carrying these unresolved feelings back into the world, while staying might finally allow them to dissolve. The house presents itself as a place where pain has already been mapped and understood, where nothing needs to be explained or justified. The closer he gets to the door, the clearer the condition becomes. Leaving will be complete only if he is willing to take everything with him, every memory, every regret, every unresolved truth the house has drawn out. The alternative is unspoken but implied: he can step through lighter, freer, if he allows parts of himself to remain behind. The house does not demand this sacrifice outright. It simply makes the relief of letting go feel immediate and tangible, like setting down a burden carried for too long. This moment reframes the house not as a prison but as a filter, offering transformation at the cost of identity. The protagonist understands then that those who left before did so incomplete, hollowed by what they abandoned. Their echoes remain in the walls because they chose relief over wholeness. To leave intact would mean rejecting the house's promise of absolution and accepting the ongoing weight of guilt and responsibility. This realization turns the door into a moral threshold rather than a physical one. The fear is no longer of being trapped, but of choosing the wrong version of freedom. As the light from the doorway flickers, the house waits without urgency, confident in the outcome. It knows that true escape requires endurance, not movement, and that staying, even partially, is easier than carrying the full burden of self into the world beyond. The protagonist stands suspended between two unbearable options: to leave and remain whole but haunted, or to stay in some essential way, surrendering fragments of himself in exchange for peace. In that stillness, the house feels closer than ever, not enclosing him with walls, but offering itself as a solution, a place where the sharp edges of memory can be smoothed away, where identity can be edited, and where escape, in its most seductive form, is indistinguishable from becoming part of the house itself.